Let's get one thing straight. What happens inside a prison doesn't stay inside a prison, especially when we're talking about infectious diseases. So today, we're diving into a landmark study that gives us the first real global snapshot of STIs behind bars. And trust me, the numbers have serious implications for public health on the outside. Let's get into it. For years, all we've really had are pieces of the puzzle. A study from this region, some data from that country. It was time to put all those pieces together to answer one single massive question. What is the true scale of the STI problem in prisons around the world?
And here's why that answer is so critical. Every single year, more than 11 million people cycle in and out of jails and prisons. And with that constant churn, prison health isn't some isolated issue. No, it's directly connected to the health of our communities.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll lay out the problem. Then we'll look at how the researchers pulled together all this evidence. We'll get into the hard numbers, talk about what they actually mean, cover what the study doesn't tell us, and then hit you with the bottom line. All right, let's set the stage. Why does a study like this even need to happen in the first place? Well, because we are dealing with a pretty significant public health challenge that, frankly, is often just ignored. Look, the World Health Organization has already flagged people in prison as a key population for STIs, and for good reason. If you leave these infections untreated, they can lead to serious complications. We're talking infertility, and they can even increase the risk of getting HIV. With millions of people moving in and out of the prison system every year, it becomes a literal bridge for these infections to spread right back into the general public. So, how in the world do you answer a question this big? You don't start from zero. Instead, these researchers took decades of existing studies and pulled them all together. Let's look at how they did it. They used a really powerful tool called a meta-analysis. Now, in simple terms, that means they didn't just read a bunch of old studies. They actually went back and statistically combined the raw data from all of them. This gives you a much bigger, more reliable picture than any single study ever could. And the scale of this thing was just massive. The team started with a mountain of over 5,000 studies. From there, they filtered it all down, keeping only the 206 most scientifically sound ones. The final result? A dataset covering 1.4 million people in 43 different countries. That is a powerful foundation. Okay, now for what you've been waiting for. What did they actually find? The data is broken down by infection, age, and sex. And this is where a very clear story starts to unfold. We're going to start with chlamydia, one of the most common bacterial STIs out there. And right off the bat, the data shows that the risk is not the same for everyone behind bars. Not even close. Among adolescents, the difference is just staggering. Almost 17% of incarcerated girls tested positive. For perspective, that's way higher than what we see in the general population. For boys, the rate was 7.4%, still incredibly high, but less than half the rate for girls. Now, when we look at adults, the rates are a bit lower overall, but that gender gap, it's still there. 6.5% for women versus 4.7% for men. This is telling us that female inmates are at a consistently higher risk, period. All right, let's move on to gonorrhea. And if you thought those numbers were stark, just wait. The pattern we just saw gets even more dramatic here. For adolescents with gonorrhea, the gap is now threefold. We see a 6% prevalence rate for girls compared to just 2% for boys. We're not talking about a minor statistical difference here. This is a massive disparity in risk. And now look at the adults. That gap becomes a chasm. 1.5% for women compared to a mere 0.4% for men. That's nearly a fourfold difference. The pattern here is impossible to ignore. So let's just put it all together on one screen. This table really drives home the two big patterns. First, for chlamydia and gonorrhea, adolescents have much higher rates than adults. And second, across the board, females have consistently higher rates than males. Syphilis is the only one that bucks the age trend, but even there, adult women still have a higher prevalence than men. Okay, so these are not just numbers on a chart. They are direct signals. They're telling us exactly where the public health system is failing and where we need to focus our attention. So what's the real takeaway here? It's this. These infections are completely treatable. Seeing rates this high, especially in young people and women, is a massive red flag. It's a clear sign of failure, both in our communities and inside the prison system. These are the groups falling through the cracks, and that affects everyone.
Now, any good piece of science is honest about its own limits, and the authors here are very clear about what their study can't tell us. This is crucial because it keeps us from jumping to the wrong conclusions.
You see, understanding the boundaries of the evidence isn't a weakness. It's actually a strength. It's what makes the entire scientific process credible in the first place.
So, what are the blind spots? Well, for one, most of this data is from high-income countries, so the picture in lower-income nations is still pretty fuzzy. The syphilis data couldn't always separate an active infection from a past one. We also don't have detailed numbers for specific high-risk groups. And finally, remember, these were mostly one-time snapshots, not a moving picture of how infections spread over time in prison.
All right, we've walked through the evidence, we've analyzed the numbers, we've acknowledged the limitations. So, after all of that, what is the one single actionable takeaway? It all boils down to this. The wall between a prison and the community is not solid, it's porous. We cannot effectively fight STIs in the general population if we completely ignore a key reservoir where these infections are concentrated. The two are fundamentally, undeniably linked. And that leads us directly to the study's own bottom line, which is a powerful call to action. Based on this mountain of evidence, the authors recommend offering opt-out STI testing to every single person entering prison. That means testing becomes routine unless someone actively says no. It's a clear, data-driven recommendation to start closing a major public health gap, a gap that, as we've seen today, affects all of us.